Hello Greenstylers, Cynthia here today with your tutorial for the Serge sweatshirt. For this tutorial, I'll be making the pin tuck front bodice, the pin tuck sleeve cuffs, and also the split collar option. As always, you can fast forward to the section that you'd like to see using the hyperlinks in the video description, or follow along with me from start to finish sewing the whole sweatshirt together. We suggest fabrics with some body or structure, such as French terry, sweatshirt fleece, or Polartec Wind Pro ribbed sweater fleece. Use the QR code here to link directly to the Serge fabric shop to find all of these options. And you can also find French terry that works fantastic at the Greenstyle shop, and that's what I'll be using today. Now here are the pieces that you'll need to cut. Cut one of piece B2, the front bodice, on the fold. Make sure to mark the center of the neckline and choose your length. I'll be making the cropped version today. If you're doing the pin tucks, mark the pin tucks onto the wrong side of your fabric. Cut one of piece B1, the back bodice, on the fold, copying the center neckline notch and following the same length line that you cut with your front piece. I like to mark the center bottom of the back bodice as well. Cut two sleeves on the fold. Mark the center sleeve notch from the pattern piece onto your fabric. Cut one each of piece B3, the front hemband, and B4, the back hemband, on the fold. It's helpful to mark which is the front and which is the back. I used a single pin for front and double pin for back. There are 3 pattern piece options for the sleeve bands, and I will be making the pin tuck version on self fabric, so I'll be cutting out those pieces. And if you're doing that with me, make sure to transfer those lines onto the wrong side of your fabric. Other options include cuffs without the pin tucks or cuffs using rib fabric. Cut 2 of piece C1, the front collar, on the fold. Make sure to transfer all notches onto your fabric and mark it somehow so that you always remember that this is the front collar. Again, I'm using a single pin for the front. You'll also need to cut 2 of piece C2, the back collar, also transferring notches and marking it so that you remember it's the back collar. Now let's begin with the pin tucks. What you're looking at right now is the wrong side of the fabric where we've made our marks. And what I'm doing is using some straight pins to mark the line onto the right side of the fabric using the pins. And I used one pin to notate exactly where the end of the line is. That way it's easier to see where your stitch line will end. The pins going along the line will help you fold exactly along that line, but make sure to remove those pins before stitching. Clips also work well to mark the fold, but I do like a straight pin to mark the end of the stitch line. And now you're going to stitch 1/8 of an inch away from the fold, from the edge of the fabric to the end of your stitch marking line. Make sure to back tack about 2 stitches at the start and end of each pin tuck. One thing to consider when using a straight stitch on knit fabric is your tension on your needle. Mine was up really high for some reason. I think it got bumped. So when I pull my fabric away, you will see some little waves on the fabric. Fortunately, on this cotton fabric, they are easy to steam and press away, but that is something that you want to practice on a scrap piece of fabric and make sure your tension isn't too high. For reference, mine was set on 6 for some reason, and I ended up changing it to 3. Another thing to consider is the color of thread you use. Because this is the right side of the fabric, the thread will be visible, and you'll have this nice little pin tuck sticking out. Repeat for the other 3 pin tucks on the front bodice, and you'll have this neat little feature on the front of your shirt. Now that the pin tucks are complete, we will take the front and back bodice and lay them on the table with right sides touching. We'll align the shoulders, pin or clip in place. We'll stitch across both shoulders using a 3/8 inch seam allowance and a stretch stitch or serger. With the shoulder seams in place, we will now open up the front and back bodice so that right sides are up and bring over those sleeves. I like to always visualize where my sleeve will go, so I'll lay it also facing up on the table into the sleeve opening where it's going to go, and then flip it so that right sides are touching onto the bodice. Align the center notch of the sleeve with the seam of the shoulders. Pin in place. And then bring over the end of the sleeve with the end of the armscye opening and pin those both in place. Pinning sleeves is always tricky because the sleeve cap curves in the opposite direction of the armscye. So what you want to do is pinch the two pieces together at the 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Don't try to pinch them together right at the raw edge because those edges will not be the same exact length. However, at the seam allowance marking, they will be the same length, so you shouldn't have to be stretching or pulling anything if you pinch and pin along the seam allowance line. As you can see, I was in a many clips mood for this sleeve and armscye. Once you've got one pinned or clipped, repeat for the other sleeve. Then stitch both in place using a stretch stitch or serger and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Alright, our sleeves are now attached. This is a good time to give that seam a press so that you can have a beautiful professional finish. Once that is done, fold everything in half with right sides touching so that we can pin or clip under the arms and the side seams. And now stitch using a stretch stitch or serger and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Now let's work on the hemband. Bring over your front and back hemband pieces and place them with right sides together. Pin or clip along the short ends. Stitch using a straight stitch on your sewing machine and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Press the seams open so that they're nice and flat. Alright, now that the seams are pressed open, we'll fold the hemband in half with wrong sides together. While doing that, it'll be helpful to find the front and back center and mark them with pins or clips. And as you can see, I've also marked the front and back center with clips on the sweatshirt that's sitting right there on the table as well. Once you're done, make sure to match up the front and back of the sweatshirt with the front and back of the band and slip the band onto the sweatshirt, aligning raw edges, matching clips, and pin in place. You will stitch using a stretch stitch or serger and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And note that you will need to stretch the band a bit in order to match the bottom edge of that sweatshirt. For the pin tuck sleeve band, we will be creating the pin tucks in the same manner that we did for the front of the bodice. Fold in half along the pin tuck line with wrong sides together, and we will be stitching onto the right side of the fabric. Again, stitch 1/8 of an inch away from the fold using a straight stitch. Repeat for the remaining pin tuck marks. You'll end up with 4 on each sleeve band. Alright, now once all those cute little pin tucks are in place, we'll fold the sleeve band in half, lining up the raw edges on the short end, and we'll stitch that in place, again using a straight stitch, but now we're using a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now press that seam open, and I just finger press this one, and then fold it all in half with wrong sides touching and aligning the raw edges to create your final sleeve band. Once again, I found it helpful to mark the quarter points on the sleeve band, with the seam being one of them, and also mark the quarter points on the sleeve opening, with the sleeve seam being one of them. Then slip the sleeve band onto the end of the sleeve with right sides together and all of the raw edges aligned. Make sure you line up the seam on the sleeve band with the seam on the sleeve. Stitch using a stretch stitch or serger and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And again, you will need to stretch that sleeve band in order to fit that opening. When stitching a small opening like this, I like to put my foot onto the inside of the opening and stitch from there. Let's make the split collar. Bring over all of your collar pieces and make sure you know which ones are the front and which ones are the back. And now we're going to lay one back collar onto one of the front collars, aligning one of the short edges. For the other pair, we're going to lay them with right sides together, aligning the opposite side. Stitch this one short side on each pair using a straight stitch and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Press those seam allowances open and then head back over to your table. Now we're going to lay these two pieces together with right sides touching. Align the raw edges along the two short ends and the top shorter curve. You'll want to pin or clip starting at the short end at the notch and all along that top edge. Make sure to align those seams, and then on the other short end you'll pin all the way to the notch as well. This is where we'll be stitching, starting at one notch, going across the top, and then coming down to the other notch. Use a straight stitch on your sewing machine, and again, we're going to start stitching right here where the notch is. Come up to the corner and then make that turn around the top. So drop your needle right at the center of that notch. Make sure to back stitch and stitch all the way up to the edge, but sometimes it's hard to eyeball exactly where 3/8 of an inch is where you want to make that turn. So I'm going to head and use my little sewing gauge to help me mark 3/8 of an inch, and you might find this little trick helpful when you are trying to stitch up to a corner and make that turn. So now I have a visual for exactly how far my needle needs to go. Drop my needle right onto that line that I've drawn. Lift my foot, turn my fabric, and now I know I've gone exactly 3/8 of an inch away from that edge. Again, make sure to stop stitching right at the center of that notch. And make sure to back tack a couple of stitches to really secure that stitch in place. And you should have done that at the beginning as well. I realized my green thread was impossible to see, so I went over with some white thread so you can see what I'm doing in this step. Right now, we need to clip the corners so we can have some nice crisp corners on our collar. You'll want to clip close to that stitching, but make sure that you do not hit it. Then we'll want to clip into the seam allowance right at the notch and right at the edge of our stitching. So we have a nice little snip right there, again, making sure not to cut any of the stitches. Fold the collar right side out, and you can just use the tip of your finger to poke out those corners. Then pull out that little rectangle of raw edges that remains at the bottom of the short ends. You should just have a nice little box at the bottom of each short end because of how you clipped into the seam allowance. You may have a little chunk of fabric sticking out like I do. That's just a bit of the notch sticking out there. But now we have a nice little bit to stitch to make that notched collar. So with everything right side out, we're going to fold the collar in half and line up those short ends. We'll be stitching 2 layers of fabric at a time. So the first 2 are going to be the 2 that are right sides touching in the center. So I am just clipping those 2 center pieces together, and there will be 1 loose piece on the back and 1 loose piece on the front that you see me just sort of pulling out of the way. Now we're going to stitch these 2 layers using a straight stitch and a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And here's a little bit closer look at what you're going to be doing. Again, let me just pull these 2 layers out of the way, and you know what? I'm going to actually clip those out of the way so they aren't blocking your view. You can see a little bit better that we're going to be stitching these 2 layers, and we're actually going to stitch all the way up to the original stitch line that we did. It is a little tricky to drop your needle down exactly at the end of the original stitch line because there are a bunch of layers of fabric up there. I found my foot was sitting up a little bit high. I would actually recommend stitch from the bottom up toward the top. But here is how it will look once you have those 2 layers stitched together. Now we're going to stitch the other 2 layers together. So refold everything in half so that those 2 layers are with right sides together, and your little raw edge rectangle box is all alone. And we'll stitch using a 3/8 inch seam allowance and a straight stitch from the edge to that same center point, and you will find that you'll end up with 3 stitches all ending at the same point. All right, and trim those loose threads as always, and here's a good look at what you end up with. In my hands, in the left and the right, are the 2 edges of the notched collar, and the bit going down is the original stitch to the corner, and they all meet at the same point. Now turn everything back right side out again, and this is your cool little notched collar. I recommend giving a nice press to give a clean finish at the top. Lay your sweatshirt with wrong side facing out. Match the back of the collar with the back of the sweatshirt, the front of the collar with the front of the sweatshirt. Then match the center fronts, shoulder seams, and center back and pin into place. Stitch using a stretch stitch or serger and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And you are done. Congratulations on completing your serge sweatshirt with really cool pin tuck details and that beautiful big notched collar. I know you're going to enjoy and wear this all fall and winter long. Thank you once again for joining me on another sewing tutorial. I hope you'll join me again. In the meantime, be sure to share your makes using hashtag GSSurgeSweatshirt, and make sure to subscribe so that you receive notification of all of our future tutorials and patterns. Until next time, happy sewing from me and all of us at Greenstyle.